The cabin was buzzing with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, cramming bags into overhead bins. Flight attendants smiled their practice smiles. The hum of conversation filled the air, vacation plans, business meetings, excited chatter about destinations. But then everything stopped. It started with a voice. Sharp, cold, loud enough to slice through the noise. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." Heads turned, eyes locked onto the front of the plane. And there, standing at the entrance to first class, was Dylan Matthew. He was tall, well-dressed in a crisp navy suit that fit him like it was made just for him. His leather briefcase hung at his side. His boarding pass was in his hand. His expression? Calm, polite, patient. But standing in front of him, arms crossed like a gate, was Mia Brooks, a flight attendant with blonde hair tied back tight, lipstick perfectly applied, and a smile that had vanished the moment Dylan approached. "There must be some mistake," Dylan said quietly, holding up his boarding pass. "This is my seat. 2A first class." Mia glanced at the ticket. Barely. Her eyes flicked over it, like it didn't matter. "I don't think so," she said, her voice dripping with doubt. "First-class passengers usually board earlier. Are you sure you didn't mean economy?" Dylan didn't flinch. He just smiled. Gentle, controlled. "I'm sure," he said. "I boarded on time. This is my seat." Mia tilted her head, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, I'll need to verify that. You understand." She took the boarding pass from his hand, not gently, and walked over to the flight attendant station near the cockpit. Dylan stood there, waiting, still calm, still polite. But the cabin wasn't calm anymore. Passengers were staring now. Some whispered to their seatmates. Others pulled out their phones, pretending to scroll, but really watching. A few looked uncomfortable. A few looked amused. One man in a golf shirt smirked and muttered to his wife, "Bet he got bumped and doesn't want to admit it." She giggled, quietly, but not quiet enough. Dylan heard it. He didn't react. He just stood there, hands at his sides, shoulders back, dignified, unbothered. At least, that's what it looked like. But inside, his jaw tightened, just a little. Mia returned a moment later, holding his boarding pass like it was evidence in a trial. "Sir," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "there seems to be an issue with your ticket. I'm going to have to ask you to take a seat in economy while we sort this out." Dylan's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "An issue," he repeated. "What kind of issue?" Mia shrugged, her smile fake and thin. "Sometimes tickets get mixed up. It happens. But we can't have you sitting in first class until we confirm everything." "Confirm with who?" Dylan asked, his voice still calm but firmer now. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago. It's valid. It's in my name. There's no issue." Mia's smile disappeared completely. "Sir, if you don't move to economy, I'll have no choice but to call security." The words hung in the air like smoke. The cabin went silent, dead silent. People stopped pretending to look away. Now they were fully watching, some with shock, some with pity, some with that ugly curiosity people get when they see someone being humiliated in public. Dylan didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just stood there, looking at Mia with a gaze so steady, so unshaken, that for a split second, she looked uncomfortable. But only for a second. "Your choice, sir," she said coldly. Dylan took a slow breath. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the back of the plane. The passengers watched him go. Some looked relieved. Others looked guilty. A few whispered to each other, shaking their heads. But Mia? She looked satisfied. Victorious, even. She turned back to her station, adjusted her uniform, and went back to smiling at the first-class passengers like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just publicly humiliated a man for no reason at all. Dylan reached row 24. Economy. Middle seat. Cramped. Uncomfortable. The complete opposite of what he'd paid for. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, sat down and fastened his seatbelt. The man next to him, mid-50s, sweaty, smelling like stale coffee, glanced over and grunted. "Tough break, huh?" Dylan didn't respond. He just pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen. Calm, deliberate, precise. He typed a message, then another, then he made a call. It rang once, twice, then someone answered. Dylan spoke quietly, too quietly for anyone around him to hear. But his tone? It was different now. Not polite, not patient, commanding. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and sat back in his seat, staring straight ahead. His face showed nothing. No anger, no frustration. Just calm. But his eyes? They were sharp, focused, like a man who had just set something in motion. Something big. Up in first class, Mia was pouring champagne for a passenger, laughing, chatting, completely unaware that in exactly 12 minutes, everything was about to change. The passengers buckled in. The engines roared to life. The plane began to pull away from the gate, and Dylan Matthew sat in silence, waiting. But what Mia didn't know was that the man she just embarrassed wasn't just any passenger. He was the one person on that plane who could stop it from ever leaving the ground. And in 12 minutes, he was about to do exactly that. The plane taxied slowly across the tarmac. Outside the windows, the Texas sun beat down on the concrete. Heat waves shimmered in the distance. Inside the cabin, the air conditioning hummed, and passengers settled into their seats. Some flipped through magazines. Others plugged in headphones. A few closed their eyes, already trying to sleep before takeoff. But in row 24, Dylan Matthew sat perfectly still. His hands rested on his lap. His breathing was even. His face showed nothing. But his mind, it was moving fast. He replayed the scene in his head. Mia's voice, her smirk, the way she looked at him like he didn't belong, like he was lying, like his ticket, his paid-for ticket, didn't matter because of the color of his skin. He'd seen it before, too many times, in boardrooms, in restaurants, in elevators where people clutched their bags a little tighter when he stepped in. But this was different. This wasn't subtle. This was loud, public, humiliating. And Dylan Matthew didn't do humiliation. Not anymore. The man beside him shifted in his seat, elbow invading Dylan's space. He smelled like onions now. Dylan didn't react. He just stared ahead, his jaw tight. A few rows up, a woman whispered to her husband, "Did you see what happened up front?" "Yeah," the husband muttered. "Guy tried to sneak into first class. Classic." Dylan heard it, every word. He didn't turn around, didn't say anything, just heard it and filed it away. Up in first class, Mia moved through the aisle with a tray of drinks. She was all smiles now, professional, charming, like she hadn't just publicly accused a paying customer of being a fraud. "Champagne?" she asked the woman in 3B, her voice sweet as honey. "Oh, yes, please," the woman giggled. Mia poured, smiled, moved on. She glanced toward the back of the plane, just once, and her smile widened, like she'd won something, like she'd put someone in their place. She had no idea at all. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good afternoon, folks. This is Captain Reynolds speaking. We're currently number 3 for takeoff. Should have you in the air in about 10 minutes. Sit back, relax, and thanks for flying with us today." The intercom clicked off. Passengers relaxed. Some yawned. Others checked their phones one last time before switching to airplane mode. But Dylan? He didn't relax. He pulled his phone back out, checked the screen, saw a reply to his earlier message. It was short, just 2 words. Confirmed. Stand by. Dylan's lips pressed into a thin line. He typed back quickly. Proceed. He hit send, locked the phone, slipped it back into his pocket. Then he leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, to wait, because what was coming next? It required patience. And Dylan Matthew had plenty of that. Up front, near the cockpit, Mia was chatting with another flight attendant, a younger woman named Jenna. "Busy day?" Jenna asked, adjusting her name tag. "You have no idea," Mia said, rolling her eyes. Had some guy try to sit in first class with a sketchy ticket. Had to move him to economy. Jenna raised an eyebrow. Sketchy how? Mia shrugged. I don't know. Just didn't feel right. You get a sense for these things, you know? Jenna looked uncomfortable. Did you scan his ticket? Didn't need to, Mia said, waving her hand dismissively. I could tell. Jenna frowned but didn't say anything. She just turned and walked toward the back of the plane, her face tight. She didn't agree, but she wasn't going to argue. Not here. Not now. Mia didn't notice. She was too busy straightening the first-class curtain, making sure economy passengers couldn't peek through, making sure they stayed where they belonged. The plane inched forward in line. One more aircraft ahead of them. Then it would be their turn. Passengers chatted. Relax. Check their watches. But then something happened. A chime. Soft. Almost unnoticeable. It came from the cockpit. Captain Reynolds glanced at his co-pilot, a younger man named Harris. You hear that? Reynolds asked. Harris nodded. Message coming through. Reynolds pressed a button on the console. A screen lit up. Text appeared. He read it once. Then again. His face changed. Just slightly. His brow furrowed. His mouth tightened. What is it? Harris asked. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen, reading the message a third time like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he picked up the radio. Tower, this is Flight 427. We need to hold position. There was a pause. Flight 427, you're cleared for takeoff. Proceed to runway. Reynolds hesitated. Then he said it again, firmer this time. Negative, Tower. We need to return to the gate. Immediately. Silence. Then the tower responded, confused. Flight 427, can you confirm? Is there a mechanical issue? Reynolds glanced at Harris, then back at the screen. Not mechanical, he said slowly, but we need to return. Now. Harris stared at him. Captain, what's going on? Reynolds didn't answer. He just turned the plane around, away from the runway, back toward the terminal. Inside the cabin, passengers started to notice. Wait, are we turning around? Someone asked. Why are we going back? Another voice said, louder now. Confusion spread like wildfire. People sat up, looked out the windows, whispered to each other. Mia appeared from behind the curtain, her smile frozen in place, but her eyes sharp with concern. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice bright but strained, we're just experiencing a minor delay. Nothing to worry about. We'll have you back on track shortly. But she didn't sound sure, and passengers could tell. A businessman in 4C frowned. A delay? We were about to take off. Mia forced a smile. Just a precaution, sir. Please remain seated. She turned and walked quickly toward the cockpit. Her heels clicked hard against the floor. Something was wrong. She could feel it. In row 24, Dylan opened his eyes. He glanced out the window, saw the terminal growing closer. Then he checked his phone one more time. Another message. Done. Dylan's expression didn't change, but deep inside, he felt something. Not anger, not revenge, justice. He slipped the phone away, folded his hands, and waited. The plane came to a stop at the gate. The engines powered down. Silence filled the cabin. Passengers looked around, confused, worried, some annoyed. What's happening? Someone asked loudly. Are we getting off? Another voice called out. Mia stood near the cockpit door, whispering urgently to Jenna. Her face was pale now, her confidence gone. And then the cockpit door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out. His face was serious, unreadable. He scanned the cabin. Then his eyes landed on someone. On Dylan. The two men locked eyes. Reynolds gave a small nod. Just once. Then he turned to Mia. We need to talk, he said quietly. Now. Mia blinked. About what? Reynolds didn't smile, didn't soften his tone. About the passenger you removed from first class. Mia's face went white. The passengers whispered. The captain looked grim. And Mia? She suddenly realized she'd made a terrible mistake. But she had no idea just how terrible. Not yet. Mia's hands trembled, just slightly, but enough. She tried to hide it by clasping them together in front of her, but her fingers were already twisting, fidgeting, betraying the panic rising in her chest. I don't understand, she said, her voice quieter now. What about him? Captain Reynolds didn't answer. Not yet. He just stood there, blocking the cockpit entrance, his shoulders squared, his face carved from stone. Behind him, co-pilot Harris watched through the doorway, his eyes darting between Reynolds and Mia like he was watching a bomb about to go off. Reynolds took a breath. Then he spoke, low and deliberate. That passenger you moved to economy, the one you said had a ticket issue. Mia nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, I was just following protocol. His ticket was valid, Reynolds interrupted. His tone was sharp now. Cold, fully paid, first class, seat 2A, purchased 3 weeks ago under his name. No flags, no issues, nothing. Mia's mouth opened, closed, open again. But I thought. You thought wrong. The words hit like a slap. Mia's face flushed red. She glanced around the cabin. Passengers were watching now, listening. Some were leaning forward in their seats, try to catch every word. She lowered her voice. Captain, I was just being cautious. Sometimes people try to what? Reynolds asked, his eyes narrowing. Sit in the seat they paid for? Mia didn't answer. She couldn't, because she knew. Deep down, she knew exactly what she'd done. And now it was coming back to her. Reynolds stepped closer. His voice dropped even lower, but somehow it felt louder, heavier. Do you have any idea who that man is? Mia blinked. Her voice came out small. No, I don't. Reynolds stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head, almost like he pitied her. You should have asked. Back in row 24, Dylan sat quietly, watching the scene unfold from a distance. He couldn't hear the conversation. Not clearly, but he didn't need to. He could see it. In the captain's posture. In Mia's face. In the way she kept glancing toward the back of the plane, like she was looking for an escape route. The man next to Dylan, the sweaty one, leaned over. What's going on up there? Dylan didn't look at him. Not sure. The man squinted toward the front. Think someone's in trouble? Dylan's lips twitched. Just barely. Maybe. Up in first class. The passengers were getting restless. A woman in 3A leaned across the aisle toward her husband. Do you think it's serious? I don't know, he muttered. But we've been sitting here for 5 minutes. This isn't normal. A businessman in 2C unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Excuse me, he called out toward the front. Can someone tell us what's going on? Jenna, the younger flight attendant, hurried over. Sir, please remain seated. We'll have an update shortly. An update? The man snapped. We were about to take off. Now we're back at the gate. That's not a delay. That's a problem. Jenna forced a smile, but her hands were shaking too. I understand your frustration, sir, but I need you to sit down. The man didn't move. I want to speak to the captain. That's not possible right now. Why not? Jenna hesitated. She glanced toward the front, where Reynolds and Mia were still talking in low, tense voices. He's handling something. The businessman scoffed and sat back down, muttering under his breath. But the damage was done. The tension in the cabin was thick now. Heavy. People were nervous, confused, angry, and it was only getting worse. Reynolds pulled Mia aside, away from the passenger's line of sight. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was razor sharp. I just received a direct message from the airline's executive office. Do you know what it said? Mia shook her head, her face pale. Reynolds pulled a small tablet from his pocket and held it up so only she could see. On the screen was a message. Official, stamped with the airline's logo. It read, Flight 427, immediate directive. Passenger Dylan Matthew, seat 2A, is a priority client. Any issues regarding his travel are to be escalated to executive leadership immediately. No exceptions. Mia's eyes widened. Priority client? Reynolds wasn't done. He swiped to the next message. This one was longer, more detailed. Dylan Matthew is the CEO of Matthew Tech Industries, a major corporate partner and stakeholder in our airline's digital infrastructure program. He is currently overseeing a $200 million contract renewal. Any service failure involving Mr. Matthew must be reported and resolved immediately. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her hands went cold. Her stomach twisted. "Oh, no," she whispered. "Oh, yes," Reynolds said flatly. He locked the tablet and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and his expression was something between disappointment and disgust. "You didn't just embarrass a passenger, Mia. You embarrassed a man who could pull funding from this entire airline with one phone call." Mia's legs felt weak. She reached out and steadied herself against the wall. "I didn't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I swear I didn't know." "That's the problem," Reynolds said coldly. "You didn't ask. You didn't check. You just assumed." Mia opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. Because he was right. She had assumed. She looked at Dylan, at his face, his skin, and decided he didn't belong in first class. She didn't scan his ticket, didn't verify his identity, didn't ask a single question. She just assumed. And now it was all falling apart. Reynolds straightened his uniform and turned toward the cabin. "Stay here," he told Mia. "Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. And for God's sake, don't make this worse." Mia nodded numbly, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Reynolds walked back into the aisle. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I apologize for the delay. We're currently addressing a seating issue that requires immediate resolution." Passengers murmured. A few groaned. "A seating issue?" someone called out. "We've been sitting here forever." Reynolds raised a hand. "I understand your frustration. We'll have this resolved shortly. Thank you for your patience." He didn't wait for more complaints. He turned and walked down the aisle, toward the back of the plane, toward row 24. Every eye in the cabin followed him. The whispering stopped. The cabin went silent. And then Captain Reynolds stopped, right next to Dylan Matthew. He looked down at the man who'd been humiliated, dismissed, and pushed aside. And then, in front of everyone, Captain Reynolds did something no one expected. He extended his hand. "Mr. Matthew," he said, his voice respectful, apologetic, "I'm Captain Reynolds. On behalf of this airline, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today." Dylan looked up. His face was calm, unreadable. He didn't take the captain's hand. Not yet. The entire cabin held its breath. The passengers stared. The captain waited. And somewhere up front, Mia realized her career was about to end. But Dylan Matthew? He wasn't done yet. Not even close. Dylan looked at the captain's outstretched hand. Then he looked at the captain's face. The cabin was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. No one moved. No one spoke. They just watched, waiting. Dylan leaned back in his seat. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't shake the captain's hand. Not yet. "An apology," Dylan said quietly. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Something sharp. "That's what you're offering me?" Captain Reynolds shifted his weight. Just slightly. "Yes, sir. What happened to you is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable." Dylan nodded. "Once. You're right. It was." He paused. Let the words hang in the air. Then he continued, his voice a little louder now. Loud enough for the people around him to hear. "I was humiliated. In front of an entire cabin of people. I was accused of lying. Of cheating. Of trying to sit somewhere I didn't belong. And why?" He looked up at Reynolds. His eyes were steady, unyielding. "Because of the color of my skin." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded, their faces tight with anger. Not at Dylan, but at what had been done to him. A woman in row 22 whispered her friend, "I knew it. I knew that's what it was." Reynolds' jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. "Mr. Matthew," He said carefully, "I can't speak to what was going through my flight attendant's mind, but I can promise you we take discrimination very seriously. This will be investigated." Fully. Dylan tilted his head. Investigated. That's a nice word. He stood up, slowly, his full height towering over the cramped economy seat. The sweaty man beside him pressed himself against the window, suddenly very interested in staying out of the way. Dylan stepped into the aisle, face to face with the captain now. "Let me tell you what I think, Captain Reynolds," Dylan said, his voice calm but firm. "I think your flight attendant saw a black man in a nice suit and assumed he didn't belong in first class. I think she didn't bother to check my ticket properly because she'd already decided I was lying. And I think if I had been white, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now." Reynolds didn't respond. He just stood there, his face tight, his hands at his sides. Because Dylan was right, and they both knew it. Dylan took a breath. Then he continued. "But here's the thing, Captain. I didn't make a scene. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I walked to the back of this plane with my head held high because I've dealt with this my entire life, and I'm tired of it." His voice cracked, just a little, just enough to show the weight he'd been carrying. "I'm tired of being looked at like I'm a problem, like I'm suspicious, like I don't deserve the same respect as everyone else." The cabin was silent, dead silent. Some passengers looked down at their hands. Others stared at Dylan with something that looked like shame. One man in first class, the one who'd smirked earlier, who'd made the joke about Dylan getting bumped, suddenly looked very small in his seat. Dylan noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. Reynolds took a slow breath. "Mr. Matthew, I can't undo what happened, but I can make this right. Let me escort you back to your seat in first class. You'll have our full service, complimentary upgrades on future flights, and I will personally see to it that the crew member responsible faces consequences." Dylan stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No." Reynolds blinked. "I'm sorry." "I said no," Dylan repeated. "I'm not going back to first class." Confused murmurs spread through the cabin. "But, sir," Reynolds stammered, "that's your seat. You paid for it. You deserve." "I know what I deserve," Dylan interrupted. His voice was louder now, firmer. "But I don't want to sit in first class on this flight. Not anymore." Reynolds looked lost. "Then what do you want?" Dylan's eyes narrowed. "I want accountability." He pulled his phone from his pocket, held it up so Reynolds could see the screen. On it was an email, official, time-stamped just minutes ago. Reynolds leaned in. "Read it." His face went pale. The email was from the airline's chief operating officer. It was addressed to Dylan, and it confirmed everything. "Mr. Matthew, we have reviewed the incident on Flight 427. We are grounding the aircraft pending a full investigation. The crew member in question will be removed from duty immediately. We are deeply sorry for this inexcusable treatment and will work with you directly to resolve this matter." Reynolds looked up at Dylan, his eyes wide. You already contacted the COO?" Dylan nodded. "I did, 12 minutes ago, right after your flight attendant decided I was a criminal." Reynolds' face went from pale to gray, because now he understood. Dylan Matthew wasn't just some passenger. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a partner, a stakeholder, someone with direct access to the people who could shut this entire flight down. And he'd used it. Mia stood frozen near the cockpit, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Jenna stood beside her, wide-eyed and silent. "What's happening?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Jenna didn't answer. She just pointed toward the back of the plane. Mia followed her gaze, and she saw him, Dylan Matthew, standing in the aisle, talking to the captain, his voice calm, his posture strong. And then she saw the way Reynolds looked at him, with respect, with fear, with apology. Mia's stomach dropped. "Oh, God," she whispered. "What did I do?" Jenna glanced at her, then looked away. "I don't know, Mia, but I think you're about to find out." Reynolds turned back to Dylan. "Mr. Matthew," he said quietly, "I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry. Truly." Dylan studied him for a moment. Then he finally extended his hand. Reynolds shook it, relief flooding his face. But Dylan wasn't smiling. "I accept your apology, Captain," Dylan said. "But this isn't about me anymore. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." Reynolds nodded. Understood. Dylan released his hand. Then he turned and looked toward the front of the plane, toward Mia. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Mia knew. She knew her career was over. She knew she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She knew that her assumptions, her prejudice, her arrogance had cost her everything. Tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but they came anyway. Dylan didn't look away. He just held her gaze, steady, unflinching. Then he turned back to Reynolds. "I'll be getting off this flight now," Dylan said. "I'll take the next one." Reynolds nodded. "Of course. We'll arrange everything." Dylan grabbed his briefcase from the overhead bin. Then he walked down the aisle, past the staring passengers, past the whispers, past the shame. And as he reached the front of the plane, he stopped, right in front of Mia. She looked at him, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Dylan looked at her, really looked at her. Then he spoke, quietly, but firmly. "I hope you are." And with that, he walked off the plane. The cabin erupted. Passengers started talking all at once. Some were angry. Some were shocked. Some were pulling out their phones, already typing furiously. Reynolds stood at the front, his face grim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "this flight is officially delayed. We'll need everyone to deplane while we address this situation. We apologize for the inconvenience." Groans, complaints, angry shouts. But Reynolds didn't care. He just turned and walked back into the cockpit. Mia stood there alone as passengers filed past her. Some glared at her. Others shook their heads. One woman muttered disgraceful. As she walked by, Mia didn't move. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, her career crumbling around her. And somewhere outside, Dylan Matthew walked to the terminal, his head held high, because he'd done what needed to be done. The plane emptied. The investigation began, and Mia's world fell apart. But there was still one more thing left to happen. One final moment that would change everything. 3 hours later, the terminal was buzzing. News traveled fast. Too fast. Passengers from Flight 427 had scattered throughout the airport, but they were all talking, texting, posting, recording videos on their phones. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, news outlets. Black CEO humiliated on flight, then grounded the entire plane. Airline under fire after discrimination incident. Flight attendant accused CEO of fraud. She had no idea who he was. The videos were grainy, shaky, filmed on phones from the back of the cabin. But they showed enough. They showed Mia stopping Dylan at the entrance to first class. They showed him walking to the back. They showed the captain's apology. They showed Dylan walking off the plane with his head held high. And the internet? It exploded. Thousands of comments. Millions of views. Some people were angry, furious at the airline, furious at Mia, demanding accountability. Others were inspired, moved by Dylan's calm, his dignity, his refusal to let himself be disrespected. And some were just shocked that in 2025, this was still happening. Inside the airline's executive office, phones were ringing off the hook. The chief operating officer, Margaret Stern, sat at her desk with her head in her hands. On her computer screen were a dozen news articles, all about Flight 427, all about Dylan Matthew, all about her airline's failure. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Ma'am, we have another call from—" "I don't care," Margaret snapped. "Hold all calls. I need to think." The assistant nodded and disappeared. Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. This was a disaster, a public relations nightmare. And the worst part? It could have been avoided. All of it. If one flight attendant had just done her job. If she just treated a passenger with basic respect. If she just scanned a ticket instead of making assumptions. but she hadn't. And now, the airline was paying the price. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text message from Dylan Matthew. Her stomach tightened. She opened it. Ms. Stern, I'd like to meet today to discuss the contract renewal and the incident on Flight 427. Let me know your availability. Margaret stared at the message. Then she typed back quickly. Mr. Matthew, I'm available whenever you are. Please let me know where and when. Again, I cannot apologize enough for what happened. She hit send, waited. The reply came almost instantly. 4 p.m. My office. Come alone. Margaret's hands shook as she read it. She had 3 hours to figure out how to save a $200 million contract. 3 hours to convince Dylan Matthew not to pull his business from the airline. 3 hours to fix the unfixable. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. At 3:58 p.m., Margaret Stern stepped into the sleek, glass lobby of Matthew Tech Industries. The building was enormous, modern, impressive, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist design, a receptionist at a marble desk who smiled politely and directed Margaret to the top floor. Mr. Matthew is expecting you, she said. Margaret nodded and stepped into the elevator. Her heart was pounding. Her palms were sweating. She'd been a COO for 15 years. She'd handled crises. She'd negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions. But this felt different. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about respect, about a man who'd been wronged by her company. And she had no idea what he was going to say. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. Margaret stepped out into a long hallway lined with awards, patents, and framed articles about Matthew Tech's innovations. At the end of the hallway was an office. The door was open, and inside, sitting behind a massive desk, was Dylan Matthew. He looked up as she entered. Ms. Stern, he said, his voice calm. Thank you for coming. Margaret stepped inside. Mr. Matthew, thank you for seeing me. Dylan gestured to the chair across from him. Please, sit. Margaret sat. She placed her briefcase on the floor and folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dylan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I want to be very clear about something, he said. What happened today wasn't just an inconvenience. It wasn't just a bad customer service experience. It was discrimination, plain and simple. Margaret nodded. I know, and I am deeply, deeply sorry. There is no excuse for what happened. Dylan studied her. Do you know how many times I've heard that? I'm sorry. There's no excuse. But nothing changes. It keeps happening. Over and over. Margaret swallowed. You're right. And I can't promise that one incident will change an entire industry. But I can promise that we will do everything in our power to make sure it doesn't happen again. At least not in our airline. Dylan leaned back in his chair. Tell me how. Margaret took a breath. We're implementing immediate changes. Mandatory bias training for all staff. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. An independent review board to handle complaints. And Mia Brooks has been terminated. Dylan's expression didn't change. Terminated. Yes, Margaret said. Effective immediately. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. I don't want her fired. Margaret blinked. I'm sorry. I said I don't want her fired. Dylan repeated. Not yet, anyway. Margaret looked confused. But, Mr. Matthew, she discriminated against you. She humiliated you. I know what she did, Dylan interrupted. But firing her doesn't fix the problem. It just gets rid of the symptom. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. Mia Brooks isn't the problem, he said quietly. The problem is the system that taught her it was okay to treat me that way. The problem is the culture that told her she could judge someone by the color of their skin and get away with it. He turned back to Margaret. Firing her makes you feel better. It makes your company look good. But it doesn't teach her anything. And it doesn't stop the next person from doing the same thing. Margaret stared at him. Then what do you want? Dylan walked back to his desk and sat down. I want her to go through the training, he said. Real training, not some half-hearted seminar. I want her to understand what she did, why it was wrong, and I want her to have to face the consequences of her actions, not by losing her job, but by learning from it. He paused. And if she refuses, if she doesn't take it seriously, then she gets fired. Margaret nodded slowly. I can arrange that. Good, Dylan said. He opened a folder on his desk and slid a document across to her. Now, let's talk about the contract. Margaret's breath caught. She picked up the document and scanned it. It was the renewal agreement for the $200 million contract. But there were additions, new clauses, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all airline staff, an independent oversight committee to review discrimination complaints, quarterly audits to ensure compliance. Margaret looked up at Dylan. You're still willing to renew? Dylan nodded. On these terms, yes, because I don't just want an apology, Ms. Stern. I want change, real change, and I'm willing to invest in a company that's willing to make it happen. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back. Mr. Matthew, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Truly. Dylan stood and extended his hand. This time, Margaret took it without hesitation. Don't thank me yet, Dylan said with a small smile. Hold up your end of the deal. Make the changes. Prove to me, and to everyone else, that your airline is better than what happened today. Margaret nodded. We will. I promise. 2 weeks later, Mia Brooks sat in a small conference room. In front of her was a diversity trainer, a black woman named Dr. Angela Pierce. Mia had been dreading this, resenting it, but as Dr. Pierce spoke about bias, about privilege, about the real harm caused by assumptions, something shifted. Mia listened, really listened, and for the first time, she understood. She thought about Dylan's face, the way he'd stood there, calm and dignified, even as she humiliated him. She thought about the passengers who'd stared, who'd whispered, who'd assumed he was in the wrong. She thought about how easily she dismissed him, how quickly she judged, and she realized she'd been wrong. Completely, undeniably wrong. At the end of the session, Dr. Pierce handed her a folder. This is your assignment, she said. Read these articles. Watch these documentaries. Write a reflection on what you've learned, and then we'll meet again. Mia took the folder. Her hand was shaking. Can I ask you something? She said quietly. Dr. Pierce nodded. Do you think I can change? That I can be better? Dr. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, gently. That depends on you, she said. But the fact that you're asking, that's a start. 3 months later, Dylan Matthew boarded another flight. First class, C2A. The flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. Welcome aboard, Mr. Matthew. We're so glad to have you with us today. Dylan smiled back. Thank you. He settled into his seat, pulled out his tablet, and began working. The flight took off smoothly. No delays, no drama, no problems, just respect. As the plane climbed into the sky, Dylan looked out the window at the clouds below, and he thought about that day, about the humiliation, about the anger, about the choice he'd made. He could have walked away, could have stayed silent, could have let it go, but he didn't, because some things are worth fighting for. Dignity, respect, change. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up calmly, firmly, and without apology and demand better, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Dylan closed his eyes and smiled. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. But today was a good day. And that's how a man who was denied his seat became the man who changed an entire airline, not with anger, not with revenge, but with dignity, power, and the courage to demand what was right. Because respect isn't given. It's earned. And Dylan Matthew, he earned his.